The aerial shot shows a vast, suffocating ocean of pine and snow in the Pacific Northwest. In a small, perfect clearing, 5 orange rescue jackets are neatly folded on the frozen ground. There are no bodies. There is no blood. There isn't even a footprint in the fresh powder. Just the empty, bright orange shells of the men who went missing. 3 investigators. Sarah, a forensic specialist who trusts only facts. Mark, a tracker who can read a broken twig like a book. And Officer Miller, a veteran ranger who has seen everything, step into the clearing. The air is so cold it feels like breathing glass. Mark finds a radio half buried in the snow. He brushes off the frost and presses play on the last recorded message. Instead of a frantic call for help, the speaker crackles with the sound of the missing team laughing. But the laughter is playing in reverse, a distorted, mechanical sound that makes the hair on their neck stand up. As the audio plays, the same sound begins to echo from the trees around them. It isn't a reflection, it's coming from inside the wood. When a search and rescue team vanishes, you send in the experts. But in this forest, the trees don't just grow, they record. Every scream, every laugh, and every last breath is stored in the bark. And now, the forest is playing back the last moments of the people who came to save it. How can 5 trained professionals disappear without leaving a single trace? To find them, the investigators have to listen to the echoes. But in this place, hearing your own voice coming from the trees is the first sign that you are never going to leave. The Ironwood Preserve isn't just a forest, it's a black hole on the map. For over 100 years, hikers, hunters, and even low-flying aircraft have vanished into this green labyrinth. It's a place where the local legends speak of the silent hunger. But this time, the stakes are higher. A high-profile search and rescue team, the best in the country, disappeared 24 hours ago while looking for a missing child. Now, Sarah, Mark, and Officer Miller are standing at the edge of the last known coordinates, and the forest is already trying to get under their skin. The atmosphere is wrong. The air is bone-chillingly cold, the kind of frost that turns your breath into a cloud of ice instantly. Yet, there is no wind. Not a breeze, not a draft. Despite the dead air, the heavy branches of the massive pines are swaying, slowly, rhythmically, like they are breathing. Check the temperature on that trunk, Sarah says, pointing her thermal scanner at a nearby cedar. The screen flashes a deep, angry red. The air is freezing, but the trees are radiating a strange, feverish heat. It's as if the wood isn't made of cellulose, but of warm, pumping blood. Miller leads them to the center of the clearing, where the 5 orange jackets sit. Sarah kneels, reaching out to pick up the top layer. She tugs, but it doesn't budge. She pulls harder, and the heavy, weatherproof fabric rips with a sickening, wet sound. They aren't just folded, she whispers, her eyes wide. They're anchored. Looking closer, they see thousands of tiny, hair-like rootlets have erupted from the frozen earth, stitching the jackets into the ground. The roots haven't just grown around the clothes, they have grown through them, weaving into the fibers like a biological sewing machine. It looks less like a campsite and more like the forest was trying to digest the memory of the men who wore them. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing whistle echoes through the clearing. It's a standard-issue ranger's whistle, the exact 2-tone signal used to call for a regroup. Miller's hand flies to his belt. His face goes pale. "That was me," he says, his voice trembling. "That was my signal. You didn't blow your whistle." "Miller," Mark says, his hand dropping to his holster. "I know," Miller replies, pulling the silver whistle from his pocket. "It's dry. It's cold." But the sound came from the tree-line, less than 10 feet away. It was an exact, perfect copy of Miller's specific breath pattern. The forest wasn't just making noise, it was mimicking. Mark ignores the sound for a second, his eyes catching something metallic half buried in the snow near a tree root. It's a high-end digital camera, the lens cracked but the body intact. He powers it on, the screen flickering to life with a low battery warning. There is only one photo on the memory card. It shows the missing rescue team. They aren't looking at the camera. All 5 of them are standing in this exact clearing, their heads tilted back, staring up at the sky with expressions of pure, religious awe. Mark looks at the sky in the photo, and the breath leaves his lungs. The sky in the picture isn't the gray, overcast ceiling of the Pacific Northwest. It's a swirling, terrifying vortex of white vapor. And within those clouds, there aren't just shapes. There are thousands of human faces, their mouths open in a silent, eternal scream. The clouds aren't water vapor. They are a census of the missing. Sarah knelt by a massive, fallen cedar, her forensic kit open. She had spent her career analyzing DNA and blood splatter, but this was different. She ran a high-frequency acoustic sensor over a fresh break in the wood. The monitor didn't show cellular structure. It showed a waveform. "The trees, they're not just wood," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of her equipment. "This specific species, the ironwood, it's a biological phonograph. The bark acts like a diaphragm, and the sap acts like a recording fluid. Every vibration, every shout, every snap of a twig is etched into the growth rings as a physical groove." The realization hit them like a physical blow. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a library of sound. And it was a predator. It didn't hunt with claws or teeth, it hunted with memory. It waited for a target, then played back the one sound that would make them stop running. A mother's voice, a friend in pain, or the cry of a child. It lured you deeper into the thicket, until you became part of the record. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. "Daddy? Is that you?" "I'm cold." Mark froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. The voice was soft, small, and carried the unmistakable lilt of a 6-year-old girl. It was a voice he hadn't heard in 5 years, a voice he had buried along with his daughter after a tragic accident. It was coming from a dense cluster of black pines 50 yards away. "Mark, don't," Miller warned, his hand firm on Mark's shoulder. "It's the trees. You know it's the trees." "It sounds exactly like her," Mark gasped, his eyes unfocused. The forest wasn't just recording the present, it was digging into his trauma, pulling frequencies from his own mind to break his focus. It was a psychological siege. To prove her theory, Sarah moved to a stump that had been sheared off by a lightning strike. The rings inside weren't the usual concentric circles. They were jagged, irregular, and sharp. They looked like the ridges on a vinyl record. "Watch," Sarah said. She took a sterilized needle from her kit and gently dragged it across a deep, dark ring near the center of the stump. The air didn't just vibrate, it exploded. A piercing, agonizing scream erupted from the wood, a scream of pure terror that had been recorded 50 years ago. It wasn't a recording coming from a speaker, the wood itself was vibrating the air. The sound was so violent it knocked all three of them to the ground, their ears ringing with the phantom pain of a half-century-old death. As the scream faded into a low, rhythmic thrumming, Miller tried to push himself up. He hissed in pain, looking down at his hand which had been pressed against the trunk of a living ironwood during the blast. "Miller, your hand?" Sarah breathed, her forensic mind short-circuiting. Miller's skin was no longer soft. It was hardening, turning a deep, charcoal gray. The texture was rough, grooved, and peeling in long vertical strips. It wasn't a rash. His skin was becoming bark. The forest wasn't just recording their voices anymore, it was transcribing their very bodies into the landscape. They weren't just being hunted, they were being written into the trees. The deeper they pushed, the more the air seemed to thicken with a heavy, vibrating hum. They finally broke through a wall of jagged brush and stood before the mother tree. It was a titan, a sprawling, hollowed-out redwood that looked like a cathedral carved from living flesh and charcoal wood. As they approached the opening in the trunk, the noise became overwhelming. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the rustle of leaves. It was the sound of a crowded stadium, thousands of voices talking, crying, and laughing all at once. But there were no people, only the tree. They stepped inside the hollow and the sight stopped their hearts. The missing rescue team was there. All 5 of them were standing perfectly upright in a circle, spaced out like pillars. They weren't dead, but they weren't free. Their boots had been shredded by thick, pulsing roots that had bored through the leather and deep into their ankles, anchoring them into the soil. Their eyes were wide, darting toward the investigators in a silent plea, but their bodies were as rigid as stone. Their mouths were locked open, and from their throats came a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrated the very air in the chamber. They're functioning as components," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she checked the pulse of the team leader. His skin felt like cold, cured leather. "The forest doesn't just record sound, it needs it. This entire ecosystem is built on vibration. It keeps them alive in a state of permanent paralysis, using them as living tuning forks to keep the mother tree's heartwood vibrating." The logic was as cold as the forest floor. The trees were a massive, biological resonator. If the vibration stopped, the forest would die. To survive, it harvested the most complex frequencies it could find, the human voice and the rhythmic beat of a human heart. "We have to get them out," Miller roared, swinging his survival hatchet at the roots binding the team leader's legs. Clang. The metal blade didn't bite into the wood, Instead, the moment it made contact, a massive, discordant frequency erupted from the mother tree. The vibration was so intense it shattered the steel head of the hatchet into 100 pieces. The sound changed instantly, a high-pitched, screeching wail that felt like a hot needle being driven into their skulls. Sarah and Mark collapsed to their knees, blood beginning to trickle from their ears as the forest screamed at them to stop. The mother tree was defending its power source. Every time they tried to interfere, the forest played back a distorted version of their own heartbeats, amplified 1,000 times until their chests felt like they were going to explode. Through the haze of pain and the deafening noise, Sarah locked eyes with the rescue team leader. He couldn't move his lips and he couldn't close his mouth, but his eyelids were fluttering in a frantic, rhythmic pattern. He's blinking, Sarah gasped, clutching her head. It's Morse code. She watched the rapid blinks, her mind racing to translate through the agony. Short, long, long. Long, long, long. Long, short. The message was simple, terrifying, and impossible to follow. Don't stop breathing. The leader wasn't just warning them about the air. He was telling them that the moment their breath stopped, the moment their rhythmic vibration ended, the forest would stop tuning them and start harvesting them. The mother tree was no longer just a passive observer. It was actively tuning into them. Sarah looked at her heart rate monitor. The pulse was no longer erratic. It was smoothing out, slowing down, matching the deep tectonic thrum of the wood. The forest wasn't just recording them, it was syncing with them. Every breath they took was being echoed by the swaying of the branches above, a terrifying, synchronized dance. If our hearts hit that same frequency, Sarah choked out, her chest feeling heavy as if it were filled with wet sand, the roots will trigger. We'll be pinned to the dirt before we can take another step. Mark gripped his rifle, but he knew lead was useless against an entity that fed on vibration. We need to break the loop, he said, his eyes darting to the rooted rescue team. The forest is a perfect recorder, but every recorder has a limit. We need a countersound. Something so chaotic, so loud and discordant that the bark can't etch the grooves fast enough. We have to jam the signal. Officer Miller stood at the center of the hollow, his movement stiff. The gray, bark-like skin had climbed up his neck, stiffening his jaw. He looked at his hands. The fingers were now long, jagged splinters of ironwood. He knew he was past the point of no return. If he tried to leave the magnetic pull of the mother tree, his internal organs, already crystallizing into cellulose, would shatter. Go, Miller rasped, the sound like a saw cutting through a log. He patted the satchel of industrial explosives at his hip. I'm already part of the record, kids. I'll stay here and provide the white noise. Miller, no. Sarah cried, but the forest immediately played back her no in a haunting, distorted loop that bounced from tree to tree. Don't waste your breath, Sarah. It's already tasting your words, Miller said with a grim wooden smile. To distract the mother tree and buy them time to reach the clearing, Miller began to do something the forest didn't expect. He began to sing. It was an old folk lullaby his mother had sung to him, a melody full of sharp leaps and complex trills. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The forest recorded the song in real time. Within seconds, 100 trees in the immediate vicinity began to sing back. It was a haunting 100-voice choir of Miller's own voice, layered over itself in a ghostly, shimmering harmony. Run. Now. Miller roared over the sound of his own ghostly choir. Sarah and Mark sprinted toward the light of the clearing. Behind them, they saw Miller standing at the base of the mother tree heartwood. He clutched the detonator, his eyes locked on the ceiling of whispering faces. As they dove behind a massive rock outcropping, Miller pressed the button. They braced for a world-shaking blast, the roar of C4 that should have leveled the grove. But the sound that came was the ultimate horror. The forest didn't explode. Instead, the mother tree swallowed the kinetic energy of the blast. The massive, fiery eruption was instantly converted into sound and absorbed by the porous, acoustic wood. The deafening roar of the explosives didn't happen. Instead, from the heart of the forest, there came a single, tiny, soft whisper, the sound of a lone bird chirping. The forest hadn't been destroyed. It had just edited the explosion out of reality. Sarah and Mark didn't speak. They didn't even whisper. The moment Miller's sacrifice was swallowed by the mother tree, they understood the rule of this forest. Sound is a tether. They tore strips from their shirts and wrapped them around their boots to dampen the crunch of the snow. They moved like ghosts, sliding between the trunks of the ironwood trees, their breath held until their lungs burned. The forest was desperate. It could feel its latest records slipping away. Suddenly, the air behind them erupted with Miller's final agonizing scream. It was raw, bloody, and so realistic that Mark nearly spun around to run back. But he saw the tree bark beside him vibrating in sync with the sound. It was a trick. Then the forest tried something more intimate. "We're safe, Mark. Look at me. We made it." The voice came from right behind his shoulder. It was Sarah's voice, perfectly pitched, warm, and relieved. But Mark was looking straight at the real Sarah. Her mouth was pressed into a thin, white line, her eyes wide with terror. She hadn't said a word. The forest was remixing her voice from earlier recordings to manufacture a lie. They didn't stop. They kept their eyes locked on the horizon, refusing to acknowledge the phantoms calling from the wood. Then, like a fever breaking, the world snapped. They crossed a jagged line of rocks where the ironwood ended and the normal pines began. The heavy, oppressive hum vanished. In its place was the messy, beautiful chaos of the real world, the distant rustle of actual wind, the chirp of a real bird, and the far-off drone of a highway. They collapsed onto the asphalt of the trailhead, weeping in total, blessed silence. The police interview took place in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room 3 hours later. The lead detective sat across from them, a digital recorder spinning on the table. Sarah and Mark told them everything: the mother tree, the rooted rescue team, and the way Miller had been absorbed into the bark. They spoke for hours, their voices raspy and exhausted. "Okay," the detective said, leaning back. "Let me play this back for the captain." He hit the rewind button and then pressed play. Sarah and Mark leaned in, expecting to hear their own frantic explanations. But the speaker didn't emit human words. Instead, the room was filled with the sound of a forest. They heard the creak of swaying branches, the rustle of leaves, and the low-frequency thrum of the mother tree. Their voices were gone. Every word they had spoken in that room had been transcribed into the sound of nature. To the police, they were just two traumatized survivors making static. To the world, they were already silent. A week later, Sarah sat in her kitchen, staring at a glass of water. Her house was quiet, but it was the wrong kind of quiet. She reached for the glass, her hand trembling. Her skin was still pale, but she could see the faint, jagged lines of rings starting to form beneath her fingernails. The glass slipped from her fingers. She watched it fall in slow motion. It hit the hard tile floor and shattered into 1,000 pieces. But there was no crash. There was no sound of breaking glass. The shards hit the floor with the soft, muted rustle of falling leaves. Sarah opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, a tiny, soft whisper of a bird chirping drifted from her throat. She realized then that she hadn't escaped the Ironwood Preserve. The forest had finished its recording. It had let her body leave, but it had kept her sound. The rescue team is still there, singing in the bark. And Sarah? She's just waiting for her first word to come back. If you heard your own voice calling from a place you've never been, would you follow it?